The turn of the 18th century into the 19th century was bathed in the light of political upheaval. France had seen revolution gone bad, and some years earlier, America had seen revolution that to all intents and purposes had gone good. More importantly, perhaps, was the philosophical revolution that gave these revolutionary periods their impetus. Inspired by thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Paine, the leaders of these respective movements inspired populations to revolt against the old order. The previous way of doing things had been irreparably damaged. This era was punctuated by a literary revolution too. Its outcome was Romanticism. Over that window preceding and following 1800, one of the most active and vibrant periods in British poetry flourished. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats and Shelley, amongst a few other names, were busy reimagining the landscape of verse and committing it to page. We enjoy their work in collections to this day, even independent of their context. Tintern Abbey, Ode to a Nightingale, The Nightingale. All are timeless works that need no background for their merits to shine through. Reading poetry, after all, is an aesthetic experience, and can be primarily sensual if one wants it to be. Intellectual exploration is certainly worthwhile, but not a prerequisite for access. Today, myself and Oliver Collins do some of this exploration. Intellectual legwork, as though we were Keats and company bounding about in the Scottish Highlands. Herein, you'll find cultural contexts and philosophy integrated with some analysis of how, through their language, these poets really did see into the life of things. We hope you enjoy the show. Hello, I'm Luke Mitchell and I'm a student of journalism.
Hello, I'm Ollie and I'm an English literature student.
And we're here today to talk to you about romantic ontology. So there are a couple of arms to this, Ollie, when we talk about romantic ontology. So the first arm we'll be talking about is the literal romantic placement in history. So here we're really talking cultural context, political context in a big way. Some massive political changes going on during the Romantic period. And the position in the world, indeed, where these poets were coming from, perhaps why. It was kind of an English-centric poetic movement, but we can talk about that as well in due course. And what kind of people were taken with Romanticism, were forming Romanticism, and why. And then we move on to the second arm of what could be feasibly called a romantic ontology, which will lead us to talk about the ontology that the Romantics were kind of not preaching, but that they were kind of creating and they were putting forth in their work. So really we're talking about the kind of world that the Romantics were building. And this will lead us onto a really interesting conversation about lyrical ballads as well by Wordsworth and Coleridge, originally published in 1798. So that's where we're really going to go today. But first I'd like to make a little distinction for the listener who will be philosophically inclined, I hope. And we'll be saying, well, hey, why aren't we talking about a romantic metaphysic or a romantic metaphysics? Why are we talking about a romantic ontology? Now, there is, of course, a important place in the study of any literary movement for the kind of metaphysics that they were putting out, for the kind of philosophical ramifications of their work. But I'm of the opinion that metaphysics means that you're really talking about being across all of time. So you're talking about the nature of man and man's place in the world, always, forever and always, amen. So you're talking about the beginning of time, you're talking about the end of time, any time, the way man is. Really with ontology, I want to kind of make this time specific. So I really want to dig into the kind of nature of being, the romantic ontology, as a kind of contextual entity. What was going on at the time, and what was being produced and why. So let's kind of set this in a historical context, Ollie. So what could you say about the kind of time frame, the historical context of when the Romantics were writing and when the movement was really kind of in its peak, and what were the kind of different phases? Can we kind of tease that out a little bit?
Definitely politically tumultuous, for sure.
Yes, quite right.
You have the American Revolutionary War, you have the French Revolution, you have later on, after the sort of second wave of Romanticism, you have Chartism and Peterloo in Manchester.
As a Peterloo massacre, am I correct?
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Very big event in sort of leading to Chartism and movements for suffrage, universal suffrage.
Right.
So definitely a tumultuous period, for sure.
Yeah, tumultuous is absolutely the right way to put it. Indeed, seismic, because it can't be underestimated. I mean, it's a real shocker that it's not taught in schools to any great extent, as far as I know, or in my experience, that the impact of the French Revolution and the American Revolution cannot be underestimated, particularly in the context of these literary movements and what was going on at the time. And the point I really want to draw out there is the fact that this really was definitionally revolution in both cases, that it is out with the old, in with the new, symbolically tearing the bricks off the Bastille and selling them the next day. The old order is ripped apart, monarchy is being questioned, and indeed destroyed, and falling under the guillotine, or indeed being kicked out of America in the French and American contexts. And again, you can't underestimate how important this is on the world scene as well. This is kind of the birth of democracy. This is Enlightenment in full swing, liberal ideas, unfortunately going fully illiberal in France under Robespierre's kind of fascistic appropriation in a very short amount of time of the revolution from 1789 through to 1793. But as I'd argue, indeed the relative brilliance of the American Revolution in bringing about democracy and liberty. So I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to expand on there.
Definitely liberty for some, I suppose you could.
Right.
I mean, it's easy to forget about the transatlantic slave trade and all of that stuff that sort of was occurring, and I mean, very much there.
Exactly, and it can't be ignored. And I suppose that took time to iron out. That we're talking about the late 1800s when we have the
American Civil War and
yes,
that sort of stuff,
and the United States socket to the Confederates in a war that effectively becomes about slavery, that was originally about succession on the part of the Confederates, and really became very distinctly about slavery and the United States cracking down and saying, this is a pretty egregious betrayal of the kind of American spirit. Abraham Lincoln, great guy. He really nailed it there. Shout out, as it were. Is that what the kids would say today? I suppose it is.
Yeah.
Shout out.
Abe.
Epic Abe. Honest Abe, that's what they call him. So yeah, you're quite right. Politically tumultuous. And my main thinking about this is that I think it would be kind of vain to just call it a political upheaval. This is a complete philosophical, world-changing, deeply ontological shift. Like I say, it's a seismic shift, out with the old, in with the new. And we're going to be talking about this in relation to Romantic poetry, really. But you can kind of by extension talk about popular journalism, historical movements, different thinkers. But we're going to bring the camera in. We're going to talk about the kind of Romantic ontology, the placement of the Romantic poets and what was going on. I don't suppose we could be as explicit to define a Romantic period when concerned with poetry. I mean, we can talk about Wordsworth's, prime and then Keats's Prime and Death and the kind of early romantics, later romantics. I was wondering if you would kind of be able to give some explicit timeframes, if at all.
Well, I mean, approximately you could say like 1770, 80
Right.
to about 1830,
Yeah.
I think would be about right.
Later romantics kind of obviously in the kind of latter portion of that, but we're talking about Keats, Shelley,
Yeah.
Byron. Really, at the beginning, we're talking about Wordsworth
First
and
wave and
Coleridge.
second wave.
First wave
sort
and
of thing.
second wave, indeed.
You could say.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll also be picking apart some of the political ramifications of that, because they had different political ideas, and I don't want to ruminate too much on politics being a kind of deterministic element in their writing, because I think that would perhaps be disingenuous. I mean, you can certainly read political meaning into a lot of romantic poetry, but I'm of the opinion that, I mean, I am admittedly a big Keats fan, so I may not read as much politics into it, but I'm of the opinion that it's not, primarily a political project. We're just trying to kind of place it, if you see what I mean. That's the
I think probably more for Wordsworth and Coleridge, you could say it's more political than, say, Keats.
I'd agree.
I think. That would be
Yeah,
fair.
and like I say, I'm a Keats fan, so I just don't read much politics in romantic poetry, but I certainly understand from lyrical ballads that's the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break off now, and I'm going to give you a little reading or two from lyrical ballads to illustrate this point, and then we'll bring it back and enjoy the poetry, enjoy the verse. Some stanzas from Simon Lee, the Old Huntsman, a poem by William Wordsworth. No man like him the horn could sound, and no man was so full of glee. To say the least, 4 counties round had heard of Simon Lee. His master's dead, and no one now dwells in the hall of Ivor. Men, dogs, and horses, all are dead. He is the sole survivor. His hunting feats have him bereft of his right eye, as you may see. And then, what limbs those feats have left to poor old Simon Lee? He has no son, he has no child. His wife, an aged woman, lives with him near the waterfall, upon the village common. And he is lean and he is sick, his little body's half awry. His ankles, they are swollen and thick, his legs are thin and dry. When he was young he little knew of husbandry or tillage, and now he's forced to work, though weak, the weakest in the village. So we heard some poetry there from Wordsworth, from the Lyrical Ballads, 1798 edition. And really we're situating this poetry in a political context, and I think to get this in its most kind of explicit presentation, you really need to go to Wordsworth's preface to the 1802 edition of Lyrical Ballads. So Lyrical Ballads is kind of held to be one of the most, if not the most important publication in romantic poetry, hugely influential. And it does deal with politics, and like I say, we're situating these poems politically. And what I read into the preface is that Lyrical Ballads, to some extent, is a populist endeavour. It's an appeal to the popular consciousness, poetry in the language of ordinary men. It's like the folk music of poetry.
For sure. Rural language.
Yes, yeah, the rural language that is on the streets. It's the kind of it's what's being spoken, and you may be able to help me with this. Actually, is this a marked change from the poetry preceding it?
I think you could definitely say that, because before you have things like Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift, and it's all quite contrived, and I think Wordsworth says it's gaudy in the preface. Right. So it's definitely a marked shift, and it gets a bit of a mixed reception at the time, because they, I think contemporary opinion is it a gimmick? Can he really write poems? Is he just trying to mask his lack of talent with this?
As if to say Wordsworth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So definitely a big shift. Yeah.
Well, this is a thing that cuts deep with me as well, and my love of Keats, because Keats was panned. As you'll know, the Cockney School of Poets. He was dubbed to be a part of this kind of. People took umbrage with what they perceived to be Keats's level of education, as though he was kind of appropriating the classics. The classic, ironically, the classic example of that is the perception that Keats knew Chapman's Homer, but not Homer.
Yeah.
So there's this idea that the Romantic project, poetically, was a kind of profane attempt to kind of mangle what poetry once was, this archaic, perhaps more ornate poetry.
Yeah, I mean, literally in the title, lyrical ballads, you have lyric and you have ballads.
Yes.
And they're literally alluding to that, this sort of new endeavour that they're undertaking.
Yeah, and I can imagine it's a similar, on a popular level, it might have been or on a critical level, it might have been a similar level of uncomfortability for folks who loved, whatever type of music back in the day, now taking umbrage with pop music.
Yeah.
It's got too many synthesizers, it's got too much auto-tune, the lyrics are devoid of meaning. We're really talking about a kind of similar thing here, that in any kind of different cultural paradigm, you've got a different type of art, a new aesthetic coming to the boil. So really, we've got this kind of appeal to the popular consciousness that's happening in the lyrical ballads. And I'll give you a quote from the preface here, just to kind of maybe punctuate this point. So Wordsworth is talking about these people. He says, from their rank in society and the sameness and narrow circle of their intercourse, being less under the influence of social vanity, they convey their feelings and notions in simple and unelaborated expressions. So that's the quote from one quote from early on in the preface there, where Wordsworth's really saying, feelings and notions conveyed in unelaborated expression. There's a sense here that this kind of fanciful, archaic language and approach to verse, first of all, isn't necessary, but it's philosophically incompatible with what people are reading.
Yeah, for sure. And also the sort of the purpose of poetry. I think he talks about like the essential passions of the heart being expressed in this simple language, and that's the most direct way of doing it. Without impediment, sort of thing. It's going direct, off the page. And
this is what I meant in my introduction, really, that if you want it to be, poetry, particularly romantic poetry, can be dealt with and apprehended in a sensual context, in a purely aesthetic, experiential kind of reception, that really you don't have to intellectualize, you don't have to engage in a way that is kind of cumbersome in terms of labour time. You can experience it. Now, I experienced this at its kind of most intense when, having not read the Romantics for a good couple of months, perhaps even borderline half a year, I came back to my favourite poem, and I'm exposing myself early here to the listener. This is a journey we'll go on together. Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. And by the end, there were tears in my eyes. And I didn't have to go with a tooth comb into the lines. I didn't have to read essays. I just felt. And indeed, I went on to read essays, and they helped kind of elaborate and flesh out my thoughts.
Yeah, just pure feeling.
Unadulterated, unmediated.
And that's like the feeling and reason thing. That's another key element.
This is a key element of the philosophy of the Romantics. And indeed a big, meaty part of Keats's negative capability philosophy that was, like much of his work, only fledgling when he unfortunately died of tuberculosis at the age of 25 on the Spanish steps in Rome in 1821. please give me a little more about that, Ollie, because it's a really good point to bring up, that we do have throughout the canon of all world philosophy a dichotomy between reason and consciousness.
Yeah.
Some philosophies prefer reason, some prefer consciousness. I think, in my opinion, the best philosophies integrate both. What were the Romantics saying, again, with a view to kind of man's placement in the world and ontology? What were they really saying about reason and consciousness?
I think primarily that feeling was more intrinsic and more could be more intrinsic to human nature. I think it's primarily what they would all agree on. The first and second wave Romantics, they would probably agree on that. And the reason at the time was sort of associated with the Enlightenment and arguments for, I suppose, monarchy and church and state and that sort of thing. And so I suppose they're sort of saying reason isn't complete enough. It's not a complete enough element to satisfy human nature.
Yeah,
sort of thing.
To guide life on Earth.
Yeah.
And by virtue of that, there's this idea that perhaps being consciousness-led to some extent, or having really an open heart to nature, can lead you to an apprehension of the world that is perceptually purer. That's the impression I get particularly from The Nightingale by Coleridge. That when the infant bids the adults listen, under the moonlight, to the Nightingale's song, what we're really getting there is the child's consciousness leading his apprehension of the world as if it were a purer connection than those adults that need to be bid listen, that the adults are kind of so bound up in their worldly affairs. Indeed, you could make an argument that Romantics were saying, adults, you're too bound up in your reason. Little Hartley Coleridge here can actually tell you some things about the world. Indeed, the Nightingale can. Indeed, looking down through the valley at Tinton Abbey can tell you, can appeal to something deeper. Yeah,
definitely. The beauty is truth sort of thing. And also it links to Rousseau, who was a big influence on Wordsworth, I think.
Sure.
Who, essentially writing that society is entirely contrived and all that sort of thing. That definitely plays into it.
I'd like to get a kind of. I'd like to take that logically somewhere else with the kind of Rousseau-French connection, because seeing as we're talking about ontology, placement, time, context, we can't ignore Wordsworth's romp in France. This is a nice little bit of context, a little bit of like saucy context for you. This is the kind of wolf whistle moment, because Wordsworth had an interesting history in France where he actually went and chilled with the Girondins for a little bit, and there's some kind of political influence there, obviously, but also famously he fathered a child with a French lady called Annette Valmont, and there are these letters that she would send where to England when Wordsworth came back to live with Dorothy Wordsworth, where she's saying, when I hold him, I hold a piece of you, that she could never quite let go of Wordsworth. And there's this interesting like transience to the Romantic poets. So I'm thinking about Coleridge and his kind of pantocracy, his political experiment. I'm thinking Keats bounding about in the Highlands, like I mentioned in the intro. And the fact that I think ontologically these people were primarily concerned with this kind of transience, this consciousness, this connection to nature, that I think we'll explore in later episodes when we actually do some contextual analysis. I mean, beauty is truth truth, beauty, that's all you know on earth, etc., and all you need to know. If you want me to kind of précis and butcher a quote from one of my favourite poems, their Ode on a Grecian Urn by John Keats, I really want to get into the kind of textual analysis, because these guys were also making some grandiose ontological claims. You know, that famous last couple of lines in Ode on a Grecian Urn, to me, is Keats really saying, look, guys, I've solved philosophy. I've sorted it out. Turn your heart towards, the nightingale that I saw when I went for my last walk on Hampstead Heath. And really, you've got it. All of your theorising may have been in vain. So this is interesting, but I'd like to pull the conversation back round, because I appreciate that I may have led us on a tangent. So really, we're talking about the lyrical ballads here in their political context. And what I glean from the preface is that it is in some measure setting lyrical ballads up in a philosophical context to really be this kind of populist endeavour, as you say, the language spoken by ordinary men.
It's probably worth pointing out that there were peasant poetry was sort of like a subgenre at the time. So
please elaborate.
It's easy to think that this is like something that Wordsworth and Coleridge sort of came up with, but that they are sort of elaborating on an existing trend in poetry at the time. I think Robert Frost, was a notable one. He may not have been. I can't remember off the top of my head.
Sure.
But definitely at the time that was something going on that they're picking up on.
Yeah, certainly. So, because I think in the kind of popular consciousness these days, people think Romanticism, Wordsworth and Coleridge, perhaps seen as the kind of originary creators. I mean, Wordsworth, even for people that aren't engaged with poetry and literature, is a name that is on par, particularly in Britain, with Shakespeare. You know the kind of guys. There's like a circle of guys that are really known in the canon of English literature. So we're going to take another poetry reading now. And when we get back from that poetry reading, we're going to be talking about a kind of political antagonism in Romantic poetry. The final stanza from The Nightingale by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Farewell, O warbler, till tomorrow eve, and you, my friends, farewell, a short farewell. We have been loitering long and pleasantly, and now for our dear homes. That strain again! Full fain would it delay me. My dear babe, who, capable of no articulate sound, mars all things with his imitative lisp. How he would place his hand beside his ear, his little hand, the small forefinger up, and bid us listen. And I deem it wise to make him nature's playmate. He knows well the evening star, and once when he awoke in most distressful mood, some inward pain had made up that strange thing, an infant's dream. I hurried with him to our orchard plot, and he beholds the moon, and hushed at once suspends his sobs, and laughs most silently, while his fair eyes that swam with undropped tears did glitter in the yellow moonbeam. Well, it is a father's tale. But if that heaven should give me life, his childhood shall grow up familiar with these songs, that with the night he may associate joy. Once more, farewell, sweet nightingale. Once more, my friends, farewell. So we've done a little bit to tease out the political context of Romanticism and the kind of ontology, the place and time that these great poets were working in. So now I kind of want to actually go to the heart of this issue. So instead of picking different bits of data about different evidence, kind of evidential bits of what Wordsworth and Coleridge might have been saying, Keats and Leigh Hunt may have been saying, although that will kind of be an ancillary factor. I really want to get to the heart of the essence of Romanticism and what it was saying about the world. That is kind of grandiose because a little bit like postmodernism or libertarianism or something like that, you're going to have lots of different fractured, parts. There are little fragments, so you can't really say what was Romanticism saying. But the Romantic project could be deemed as essentially reactionary or conservative, or essentially liberal/progressive. I think there's a dichotomy here that we could talk about, that there is a certain romantic essence in the aesthetic, in the poetry that these people were putting out, that has some sort of logical, philosophical/political consequence. So I'll give us a little bit of evidence here to kind of supplement what I'm talking about. We spoke about Wordsworth and Coleridge doing work in the field of poetry that was dealing with the problems of feudalism, making allusions to a liberal, revolutionary effort. Indeed, we know from their context they were influenced by the French and American Revolution.
Rousseau.
Influenced particularly by Rousseau. Can you add anything to that in particular, by the way, before we move on?
Well, I mean, his discourse on inequality, I think, was an influence on Wordsworth. And you can see that in the nature fascination in Romanticism generally, I think. Right.
Yeah, certainly. So you've kind of got that particular context, and we can see that at the beginning, Wordsworth, particularly in lyrical ballads, is concerned with chiefly the liberation of man from feudal oppression, if you want to read a bit more into the revolutions, monarchical oppression. One of my favourite political works from the time is...
Favourite oppressions.
One of my favourite oppressions is... being a good enlightened, passionate liberal, which may bias my conversation here, by the way. Being a kind of impassioned, enlightened, or I hope enlightened, liberal, progressive, I am a big fan of Common Sense by Thomas Paine, our guy who actually took up residence very close to us in a town called Lewis, about 15 minutes away from here. But he left Lewis and went to America and published Common Sense and effectively said to the American people, why are you still listening to the English monarchy? They are, to all intents and purposes, a bunch of dum-dums. And not only are they dum-dums, but they're illegitimate. And their rule is illegitimate, and we need to expel them from these lands. And, Common Sense was famously held by Washington, I believe, and held by American revolutionaries.
Definitely a big thing.
Oh, definitely.
He's a founding father, isn't he?
Thomas Paine took kind of the word from an endorsement from Benny Franklin when it founded Pennsylvania, and indeed dropped Common Sense at the beginning of 1776 in America, that fateful year where, in my opinion, the kind of American project got kicked into motion and finally completed with the Civil War and the virtuous mission of the United States Army against the Confederates.
It was sort of like a world war at the time, because France got involved, that, which is an interesting thing, I think, that often gets forgotten. People just think it's the Americans and the British, but...
Well, that's a really good take, because that contributes to this kind of ontology, this world placement for all people.
Yeah.
We're not although we're talking about romantic poets and politicians and political pamphleteers, we're also just talking about people and the revolutionary spirit. Quite right to contextualise it in the light of a kind of preliminary early World War. So we're talking about Wordsworth and Coleridge kind of being along these lines, but for me the seeds of reaction, the seeds of Wordsworth's later conservatism were being sown in the preface. A particularly striking line here from the preface to Lyrical Ballads, and I quote here, Wordsworth talks about the increasing accumulation of men in cities, where the uniformity of their occupations produces a craving for extraordinary incident. End quote. So what that really says to me is there's kind of this small c conservative notion influencing what Wordsworth's doing here. He's reacting to indeed one of the consequences of the American project really beginning. And motions at home in London, other cities where cities are being built. Industrialization is happening. And he's kind of taking umbrage with this. He's saying, well, actually, it's a very common kind of, I suppose, anti-capitalist critique these days that people are becoming alienated from their true selves, that men are going to work in the cities, men being the kind of academic idiom, not in a sexist sense, that people are going to work in cities, becoming alienated, and they have this craving for extraordinary incident.
Yeah, for sure. And it's kind of you can see the influence of earlier poets like Goldsmith and who are writing very similar sentiments in their poems.
And that's earlier poetry, so that's preceding.
Yeah, that's like 1750.
Right.
So a few decades before. So yeah, it's a rife idea, I think.
Yeah, and although not avowedly or explicitly romantic, in terms of a romantic tradition,
definitely pre-romantic, sort of like a precursor.
Yeah, excellent, and that's kind of what you were alluding to earlier. Wordsworth and Coleridge perhaps picking up on a tradition that had already had its kind of
separate thing,
seed sown.
But definitely, they were definitely soaking up what was around them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And perhaps, maybe some of their merit is just the fact that they did it in a kind of big way. They were kind of they gave it the artistic impetus. They were the kind of aestheticians of the movement, of that idea.
They could definitely synthesize it in a way that holds up.
Yeah, certainly. So to get back to this kind of essence of romanticism, I wonder if you follow what I'm saying here, that perhaps you could get to a heart or a true essence of romanticism where you could perhaps say that philosophically it is either in the spirit of reaction or in the spirit of progress. Now, we know that Wordsworth, later in life, arguably at the behest of Edmund Burke, adopted a kind of more conservative philosophy. But in that kind of later romantic period also, Keats and Hunt were... Leigh Hunt, the kind of establishing figure of The Examiner, which was a Whig reformist magazine. What you've essentially got there is Keats and Hunt being these radical Whig reformists, the seeds of which for Keats were sown actually in his school years, in the library of the school of John Cowden Clarke.
Right.
Of course, John Keats would become later very good friends with Charles Cowden Clarke.
Right.
But John Cowden Clarke was a big endorser of the American Revolution. And thus Keats was always surrounded by works of literature, I suppose. He was reading books that were very much pro-revolutionary. And this, to some extent, must have informed his kind of politics. Although, like we said earlier, I don't glean a lot of politics essentially in John Keats in the same way that you can in Wordsworth and Coleridge.
Definitely not.
Would you agree?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's not evident at all, I think, in Keats.
Yeah, so it was at the Enfield School that in the kind of portrayal that Nicholas Rowe gives, he says that Keats was reading these kind of texts at Enfield, and this no doubt laid the foundation of his love for civil and religious liberty. So there's one thing to say here, that in terms of this ontology, this placement in time that we're talking about with the Romantics, you might have to abandon some of your conceits, if you have any, about what you call liberal, what you call conservative, about what you call, whatever politically, because we're really talking about reaction and conservatism in as much as conservation of nature, perhaps even of monarchy, of a old order, and then we're talking about liberalism and progressivism with regards to this newfound love of civil and religious liberty. My opinion, that's the better side of the argument. You'll have to forgive me. I'm looking for a quote here in one of my notes, as often I do. Yes, so this is a quote from Keats writing to John Taylor in 1818. So I'll quote here. Keats writes, "I find there is no worthy pursuit but the idea of doing some good for the world. Some do it with their society, some with their wit, some with their benevolence. Some with a sort of power of conferring pleasure and good humour on all they meet, and in 1,000 ways all dutiful to the command of great nature. There is but one way for me. The road lies through application, study, and thought. I will pursue it, and to that end purpose retiring for some years." So there's this kind of idea of a good of society being born in the respect of individual rights and religious liberties. You can trace this back to John Locke, and in a later context, as I was saying, with Thomas Paine. Now, I've evaded twice and gone on two tangents. I will, I promise, get back to the actual purpose of this segment now, which was to basically say, could you give some thoughts, Ollie, perhaps with reference to verse that you may remember, on whether or not there are more conservative or more progressive notions in Romantic poetry?
I mean, you can definitely make an argument for conservative notions. It's essentially reacting to social change. However, I mean, poets like Shelley are definitely very forward-thinking. I think more liberal, in the classical sense, I guess. But I mean, I think Wordsworth and Coleridge's poems definitely lends itself more to a conservatism.
Certainly.
I think, although I think they never lost a sort of desire for reform, maybe. But perhaps that was tempered by the French Revolution and stuff.
Yeah, certainly. So we can kind of divide it along lines of the poets themselves. I think there is obviously this distinct difference between the kind of early Wordsworth and Coleridge and the later Wordsworth and Coleridge. Like I say, at the behest of Edmund Burke, there's evidence that Wordsworth's opinion changed in the direction of a conservatism.
Yeah, definitely. French Revolution. Sure.
I mean, I like to think that...
And also Byron, like fighting the War of Independence.
Now, tell us
in Greece.
about the War of Independence.
I don't know much about it, to be honest.
You mentioned it in passing the other day, didn't you? And it was kind of an interesting bit of trivia almost, but...
Yeah, it just came across it, and I just found it really surprising.
And he's kind of a war hero out there.
Yeah. Yeah, he died out there. Because he yeah. I'm not really sure what the war was about, but there's like towns and streets named after him. It's crazy.
Yeah, that's that is a funny point of trivia. That I suppose for all of their kind of literary pursuits, these people were fundamentally involved in the political movements of their time. So just to punctuate this point, I've got a quote from that I'll kind of précis from Nicholas Rowe's book about the kind of Keatsian politic, the way he was taking things, called Keats and the Culture of Dissent. And it's this idea that for Coleridge, as well as the laureate Southey, this kind of quote-unquote popular philosophy encouraged stirrings of the mind with all their restlessness, which had led to the revolution in France. Because there was a lot of scepticism at the time about the nature of the French Revolution. Yeah. It's like, well, hold on, guys, this is a pretty extreme change
for sure
that you're enacting here. A description also of a tubercular society, interesting in the context of Keats, which basically weakened intellectual, religious and moral constitution. And I know that this is a strain that follows in reactionary and conservative thought today, that they say, well, man has become disconnected from his kind of spirituality, that by virtue of a liberal, enlightened society, he's become addicted to appetites as opposed to in love with God or in love with the earth, indeed. I mean, I'm of the opinion that I think Romanticism is best set morally in the context of liberalism, that for its glorification of man and freedom and nature, that's the way things should be. I don't know what you think about that.
Definitely the emphasis on like the individual in Romantic poetry definitely lends itself to that. And thinking about things like the sublime, that's, individual perspective.
Certainly.
Experience. That's the main preoccupation there.
And this preoccupation with the idleness and the sublime is really interesting, because that is essentially an individualistic pursuit. Wordsworth talking a lot about this notion of idleness, that I can't remember the name of the poem, but I think it might be Postulation and Reply. It's a really egregious thing. If I've got that wrong, I'll check it later. But Wordsworth basically has this interlocutor sitting on a rock, and there's this chap kind of questioning him, saying, "What the bloody hell are you doing sat on a rock? You're a fool. You should be reading a book. You should be studying. You should be doing something to further your intellectual capacity." And this other, the interlocutor sat on the rock, who we can take probably to be the narrative voice of Wordsworth, says, No, I'm sat here. I'm idle, and I'm learning. I'm engaging with nature, and I'm letting it affect me. And I'm the thing about that, and the very astute observation you made, Ollie, is that is essentially an individualistic pursuit in as much as it's perceptual.
Yeah.
So that others don't perceive for you. You can actually just wander off into the Lake District, sit on a rock, and you don't need anyone else. You are enlightened. You're free. You're liberal, and so much for the political ramifications. But that in itself, I think, is part of the magic of Romanticism. And if it gets bound up in this kind of repressive conservatism.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's the antithesis, for sure.
Yeah. But you can see how this antagonism could be drawn up as well, because some of those fundamentally conservative notions come not only from a societal context, but also from this idea that industrialization, liberalism being the great enabler for it, has real terms consequences for what we'd think of today as the environment, or kind of ecology, what they would have thought on back there as the kind of nature in its kind of perfect state and its kind of unmediated form. So would you agree that there's perhaps an argument for a bit of both?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Both conservatism and
and kind of a more kind of progressive take, because what I was really driving at, that I kind of tangentially kind of skirted around for a little while in our conversation, was the fact that I feel like there must be some sort of thing that Romanticism essentially is, philosophically. But it might be fair to say that you've got a bit of both, that it's not necessarily one or the other. I just prefer one because I'm a liberal. Yeah. But
I think there are definitely different strands that you can read into it. I mean, and also the idea of Romanticism is kind of like a historical retrospective thing. I mean, it wasn't it's a grouping that's been applied retrospectively. Like these poets may have conceived of themselves completely differently.
Yes. Well, Keats, of course, died convinced that he'd be forgotten.
Yeah. So I think it's definitely possible that they various different like political objectives could be read into. But but broadly, I think a bit of both, bit of conservatism and reaction against what was going on, and a desire for a bit of change.
That's a really interesting take, because I hadn't considered actually that doing a romantic ontology presupposes that these guys were living, working and writing in a time that they would indeed consider themselves to be a romantic kind of phase.
It wasn't really a term that was around back then.
Right.
I don't think.
And as far as regards our kind of it's like an ontological imposition. We're kind of retrospectively, like you say, kind of applying this label.
Yeah.
Which is absolutely fair. I mean, it's a fair label, but
yeah. It's not one that they would have been familiar with themselves.
No, definitely. And indeed, I think perhaps Keats had this kind of Cockney school critique levelled at him, and it maybe to some extent hung over his head. I mean, how could it not, if you've been panned in the kind of what was then a kind of snobby lit crit circle, who, by the way, they were dealing with some very literary conservative approaches themselves. These guys were, like we said earlier in the podcast, like, whoa, we're a long way from Pope here, and perhaps, like conservatives were saying at the time, look at what's happening in France. France was on fire at that point, 1793.
Yeah, exactly.
Heads are really rolling. in a kind of fascistic regime that Robespierre had announced himself as the glorious leader, they were like, well, maybe this is kind of a bad move to get rid of the monarchy, kind of completely shift the power center. And maybe they were just on a kind of micro level worried about that in aesthetics as well. Well, I'll lead us into another poetry reading now, and then we'll get back on track for the conclusion of this podcast. A stanza from Ode to a Nightingale by John Keats. Darkling I listen, and, for many a time, I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many amused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now, more than ever, it seems rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. Still wouldst thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become a sod. So we're pulling into the conclusion now, and despite all my tangents, we are going to get onto the second promised arm of what I'm kind of calling a romantic ontology here. That's kind of a phrase I've coined for the purposes of this show, I suppose. And really we're talking about the kind of ontology, not that the Romantics were sitting in now, but the one that they were kind of suggesting, what they were putting forth. So what this really means is ontology being a branch of metaphysics, man's place in the world. What the Romantics were saying fundamentally is going on with man. A key concept in Romanticism is what's going on with man's relation to nature. How does man relate? What's going on there? So, Ollie, I thought I'd give you the stage for a minute just to kind of start to flesh out some of those thoughts.
Yeah, nature's definitely a huge part of Romanticism, and I think you can trace it back to Rousseau and his basic statement that society is contrived and it's directly responsible for these inequalities and envies and sort of distortions of human nature, I think, is essentially his central point in his discourse. So that's happening, and I think Wordsworth and others are perhaps responding to that, and that's forming their beliefs about nature and the essential goodness of it. And that sort of carries through, I think. There's also the poetic part of it, in that it's nature is sort of like a poetic motif, I guess. And yeah, I mean, like in the Nightingale, like nature is like a reflection of the onlooker being refuted, and that it's essentially good in itself, that sort of idea. And that carries through to Keats, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that you pick up on Rousseau with this idea of a kind of contrived or constructed society, because what I read into Rousseau is perhaps something that is essentially negative when compared to the more positive approach of the Romantics. So Rousseau's kind of, I suppose, as a political philosopher would, is really picking up on the kind of worst excesses of what he perceived to be man's construction of an unequal society, these other perhaps transgressions against man's nature. Whereas in the Romantics, I think because you're dealing with aesthetics, an aesthetic pursuit that is often lyrically reading a little bit like a hymn, you're dealing with a positive approach. So we've got something more like, particularly in the later Romantics, a kind of borderline fetishization of nature, but it's a bit crude to say that because it's a
You
kind
can
of
make a case for it, though.
You could, but perhaps fetishization is wrong because it's also this kind of deep metaphysical connection and love for nature. In that respect, it's kind of carnal, borderline sexual. It's a real deep integration between man's essence and the world around him. So this is what we're really getting to with the romantic ontology. They're saying things,
Yeah, right. Yeah.
you know, about the way man is involved with the world. And like we were saying earlier, there's something about a kind of primacy of consciousness here. The world being impressed upon the person. In a way, like in expostulation and reply, they'd profess doesn't need much mediation with reason. And that's a very particular kind of positive approach of the Romantics. There's an interesting thing with Keats in particular, where there's this kind of antagonism with the love of nature being soaked in melancholy. I mean, you will particularly read this in Keats. In a way that I wouldn't read into Wordsworth and Coleridge. It's always a kind of glorification. I'm thinking to Tinton Abbey here, you know, life and food for future years. Wordsworth making that memory, the beautiful pastoral scene, the chimneys with the smoke and the hedgerows, being impressed upon him. We know that Keats would ruminate often with regards to Fanny Brawne, that he would ruminate on her loveliness and the hour of his death. Keats was someone painfully half in love, famously, with death.
Yeah. Easeful
Death, yes. And fade with thee into the forest dim. And I think soaked in melancholy is the best way to put this. I'm not sure. I'd love to hear your thoughts on, is a love of nature and a love of life compatible with this kind of Keatsian melancholy? Are they one and the same? Is it an acceptance of one's nature? Is it kind of this serene, is it like blissful ignorance? I'm ready. Take
Maybe,
me.
yeah, like the negative capability.
Negative capability.
Sort of idea. Yeah. I think there's definitely a contrast there between Keats and definitely Wordsworth and Coleridge and probably Shelley and Byron as well. Yeah, what were you going to say?
Yeah, well, this is oddly enough a critique that I would level at Wordsworth and Coleridge, and perhaps why my love of Keats is so strong. Is that I think Keats has he really hit the nail on the head by infusing that melancholy, tugging at the heartstrings, the kind of frankly quite a dim view of man as well. You know, in Ode to a Nightingale, we get this insight of these old blokes in the pub and their, you know, the sad palsy shaking a few, you know, last grey hairs on their head. These kind of drunken people in a state of half idiocy that I'm not one for a dim view of man myself. I'm actually one for a glorified view of man. But I think in an aesthetic sense, that kind of melancholy, the acceptance of death, perhaps even a love of death, stoically liberating. I think that's one of the things that I find fascinating in Keats, is that the man died young, and, you know, he said frankly to Browne, I believe, when he became tubercular, became consumptive. It's that kind of quote. He's saying, well, that drop of blood on my bed sheets is my death warrant. I must die. And his life then becomes, you know, his most productive years ensue, writing these wonderful poems in the context of certain death. And there's something about there, maybe even a Keatsian ontology, that you could say, well, in the span of such a short life, that's something I can never believe about. Well, you know, I can believe, but I find astounding about Keats. I'm 21, and well, hey, my achievements are as such, but this guy writing Endymion, the odes, the sonnets, these people were prolific as well. We could say that about the Romantics at least, right? I mean, we're obviously quite deeply read in them. I must admit, I'm not so well read in Byron and Shelley. I was wondering if you could kind of contextualise.
No, I'm not either, actually.
Yeah,
But
I'm a big Keats man.
Yeah, no, Shelley writing like similar time as Keats.
Yes, corresponding with.
Yeah, for sure. Very similar stuff, nature. Probably more of like a social consciousness going on with Shelley, though.
Yeah.
He was definitely more involved with ideas outside of poetry and stuff. And Byron, I'm not really well. I don't know Byron too much.
Yeah, nor am I.
But I think Keats definitely stands as like an emblem of that period, I think.
Certainly. I mean, one of the things we've established today is that Keats is something of an outlier in terms of any explicit kind of political kind of evidence in his writing when compared to Wordsworth and Coleridge. One thing I will say is that for Keats's deep involvement with Leigh Hunt and the Examiner, this radical reformist magazine, whenever you read green imagery, verdant imagery in Keats's poetry, there's evidence there that's tied to the verdant and the green being thematically linked with liberty. This is an interesting kind of thing that you'll see in flags and crests of the time, that the idea of civil and religious liberty is something baked into the green. And as we know, that's imagery that is in abundant supply in Romantic poetry, just by virtue of looking upon nature. Most of those things are green.
Yeah.
And maybe you'd have a tenuous link or a difficult time trying to actually objectively evidence that and be like, oh, green stuff, liberty, but certainly in Keats there is evidence of that. Well, we'll close up the show for today. And I'd really like to close with some kind of remarks about the split that we've identified here, which is really regarding a Romantic ontology, that there is a time and a context and a kind of historical moment in which the Romantic movement kind of exploded. It was a time kind of hinging over this contingent and vibrant period of the turn of that century into the 1800s.
Yeah, sure.
And tumultuous times before, like you astutely identified at the beginning of our show, and tumultuous times after the 1800s.
Yeah, definitely.
Also an age of revolution.
Yeah.
Also an age of industrialization. Perhaps the logical conclusions of those revolutions preceding 1800, now being lived out. For better or for worse, that's the object of a lot of political debates today. But we've identified that kind of ontology that the Romantics were operating in, but we've also identified some of the ontology that they were really professing about man's relation to nature, man's integration with nature. And if we are to take this podcast further, oh boy, we're going to be doing some reading. We're going to be taking you, a little bit like today, through some verse, through the minds and the writings of these wonderful and inimitable poets, and bringing you closer to see into the life of things. So, Luke Mitchell signing off. Thanks for joining me today, Ollie.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.
And I shall see you again soon. Thank you for listening to this, the Into the Life of Things podcast. I've been Luke Mitchell, your producer today. I was joined by my guest Oliver Collins. The audio was engineered by Isaac Bannister, and the music in this podcast is royalty-free music composed by Johnny Easton. Thanks again for listening.